There are two schools of thought, and two only, about politics. One is that lack of life experience makes people bad at politics. And the other is that life experience itself makes people bad at politics. Which do you think is worse? Sitting down and trying to come up with pragmatic solutions for climate change with a bunch of teenagers who really have no life experience yet, or sitting down with 55-year-old career computer programmers? Trying to talk politics with guys who've spent their whole lives working in computer programming? Very frustrating, very counterproductive. What's going on in terms of the translation of climate science into political action? It's partly so tragic and counterproductive because climate scientists have a lot more in common with computer programmers than they have in common with political philosophers, or, to be blunt, people like myself who spent their whole lives obsessing over political philosophy, political history, the organization of social movements, the way parliaments and governments work, so on and so forth. We have the ultimate situation in which those who have the technical expertise to inform public policy are themselves the least able, the least eloquent to do so. They are even less eloquent than 16-year-old Greta Thunberg, who obviously is speaking with no life experience, with no technical knowledge, so on and so forth. I like to start these videos by dealing with a very palpable, tangible, real-world example instead of abstract reasoning. When you open a can of carbonated water, fizzy water, if you sip it, it tastes different from flat water, from water that came out of a bottle that never was carbonated. Set the two bottles to one side and wait while all of the bubbles disappear. Taste them both again. They still taste different. It's not just the bubbles. It's not just the carbonation. Carbonated water is made more acidic through the process of carbonation, through exposure to carbon, even after the water has settled down, even after the bubbles have left and evaporated. The same thing happens to the oceans. Acid oceans, or ocean acidification, is one of the least discussed aspects of climate change today. It's one of the most irreparable and insoluble. And the reason why people aren't talking about it is because it's not easily manufactured into a civilization-threatening crisis. If humanity now sits by and does nothing and allows the oceans to become more and more acidic, it will wipe out all of the coral reefs on planet Earth. That'll be the first thing to disappear. It'll wipe out almost all of the large fish species. As I understand it, jellyfish will do okay. Tiny single-cell organisms will be okay. There will be kind of winners and losers, but marine life as we know it will cease to exist. Human civilization will be fine. Nobody will eat lobster ever again, but human civilization can continue just fine without anyone eating lobster. That presents a tragedy that's much closer to what the climate change crisis really confronts us with than what people like Greta Thunberg, people like Extinction Rebellion are talking about. There's an attempt to manufacture or misrepresent the nature of the threat so that humanity itself will cease to exist, will be decimated, so that civilized society will cease to exist, to even pose the notion that democracy will cease to exist and will be replaced by fascism. I've heard Extinction Rebellion say that again and again, and I think Greta is influenced by their verbiage to some extent. I recently heard an interview by a mainstream news source. I'm going to choose not to say who. And they said, oh, well, rising ocean levels. So, this is the idea that the actual, the location of the ocean will change, and certain cities and inhabited areas now will become submerged underwater. Rising ocean levels will entail so many trillions of dollars of damage, a certain percentage loss in GDP globally, and so on. And the other person being interviewed here said, oh, well, here's the footnote on those projections. It's true that if you just take a map of the world and color in the coastlines blue to represent the ocean coming in, and then you calculate the damage, you get these astronomical figures. However, if you actually try to simulate the gradual series of stages whereby people would relocate, whole cities might be abandoned, sure, but still happens gradually enough. New infrastructure gets built, new types of crops are planted to replace old crops that don't exist anymore. When you compensate for the different types of infrastructure that can be built to help civilized countries cope with this, however you want to put it, well, then the numbers are suddenly dramatically lower. We're talking about a fraction of a percentage of GDP being lost, and so on and so forth. That really it no longer sounds like a disaster at all. And you could hear it in the voice of the interviewer in response to it. It was like, oh. And I would say, both in terms of what he said and how he said it, I felt that his concern was, if he took this news and broadcast it, he was eroding or undermining the rationale for sudden dramatic action in response to this as an emergency. I used to live in Bangkok, Thailand. Again, I'm trying to keep these tangible, palpable examples. I worked in museums when I was there, so historical research for museums. And one day I was down at the construction site where one of the museums was going to be built, and you saw one of these machines digging into the earth, scooping the earth, and just when it was a few millimeters below ground level, there was water. This is semi-saline ocean water mixing with river water, in Bangkok. And I suddenly realized it's as if we're all standing on a lily pad. This part of the city, at least, is a very, very small distance above sea level. And from that moment on, I started joking with the other people involved in the planning and development of this museum. Look, guys, we've got to be planning to make the world's greatest underwater art museum, world's greatest submersible history museum, because this is all going to be underwater just a few decades. Okay. It is true, the odds that downtown Bangkok would be abandoned are pretty solid. They're pretty good odds that Bangkok, as a specific example, is a city I know, and there may be all kinds of sentimental reasons why that would be a crushing blow to the culture and history of Thailand. But let me ask you something. Do you actually think the statues, the works of art that are in the National Museum in Bangkok would be destroyed? Or do you think that as temperatures rise and ocean levels rise, there would be an organized response to that threat, that the city would be evacuated, that cultural heritage would be removed and relocated elsewhere, that in fact it wouldn't be the end of life as we know it? It would just be a reorganization of that society. A few million people would move to the northeast, a few million would move to the northwest, so on and so forth. But it wouldn't be the type of crisis, the type of threat that's being now manufactured and presented to the mainstream press. So the problem with the sky is falling narrative, with the crisis narrative of the threat of global warming, the civilization ending, humanity ending narrative, is twofold. One, it's going to lead to people doing the wrong things. But two, this is the one that interests me more, it's going to lead to people doing the right things for the wrong reasons. Okay? Our motivations matter. All right? What are we going to do about the tragedy of ocean acidification? Right? There's a sense in which it doesn't touch us, but it's our moral responsibility. Wiping out the vast majority of ocean life, it's a terrible thing. It's a terrible stain on the moral record of humanity, however you want to think of it. Okay? But to try to present the reason for that being self-preservation, it's not self-preservation. It's not defense. It's not for us that we do it. At some point, we have to start making decisions morally. We have to resolve ethically to do the right thing simply because it is the right thing to do. Okay? To see that as being in our self-interest, even though it is, in all honesty, not self-serving. I'm going to mention right now two of the open secrets of the climate change crisis. Two of the solutions that are staring us in the face and for which all the science has been done. It's known they can be deployed. Okay? One is very simply called misting technology. Doesn't sound that scientifically complicated because it's not. And the second are reflective arrays of satellites. Okay? Very briefly, misting, the fantasy form of this technology is to have boats skimming around on lakes and oceans, and ideally they're solar-powered boats, but it can be done with a smokestack in a factory. If you produce white, puffy clouds of mist of almost any kind, it can be water vapor, but it could be a form of carefully, intentionally manufactured industrial smoke. White, puffy clouds reflect the sun's rays. White puffy clouds do cause local and global cooling, and it's entirely within our means to start generating, in this sense, mist or cloud cover. Yeah, the numbers have been crunched on it. Completely cynical solution number two, deploying satellites that will reflect the sun's rays away from the surface of the Earth. This would be most effective if you had satellites along the edge of the Arctic ice mass and in South Africa, along the edge of the Antarctic ice mass. I've talked about this with two engineers in that line of work, guys who work on things related to rockets and satellites, what have you. And I remember in both conversations at first they were kind of excited that, oh, well, that would be tremendously complicated. And I said, no. You know what's complicated? Having one satellite capable of launching a missile that will hit another satellite. That's complicated, and we can do that. When you're talking about just putting a satellite in orbit and then having it basically unfold aluminum foil, that's incredibly simple, and it's already been done. It's not just past the experimental phase. I know about experiments done by the Russians, and they come up politically because weather weaponization is illegal under international treaties, but they've done much more sophisticated things than just cooling through satellites. So satellites in near Earth orbit, it can be done, and it's cheap, and then basically the amount of solar radiation coming in is like a faucet. You can turn it off and on with these two technologies. All right. There's a list of other solutions to start knocking off huge percentages of the problem. And each of those solutions comes with a different kind of cost. Here in Taiwan, I live on the island of Taiwan, if you couldn't guess from the background of the video, the government just committed to build a new train line that will be approximately 20 kilometers, approximately 13 miles. And that new train line, so it's very short, it's just one extra stop on an existing train network. That new stop on the train will cost $2 billion US. $2 billion. Okay. For countries like the United States of America and Canada to radically reduce the reliance on automobiles through building railroad networks, world-class 21st century railroad networks, trillions of dollars. And Taiwan has a very fundamental advantage there. That train line they're building it in an economic context that's unbelievably vital. To ask a question about Canada, this will be easy for you guys to imagine, even if you've never been to Canada. Why isn't there a high-speed rail linking Saskatoon to Regina? Saskatoon, the city in northern Saskatchewan, to Regina, the capital of Saskatchewan. Why not? Seems like the most obvious and noble thing. It's because nobody in Canada is really confident that the city of Saskatoon has an economic future. Nobody really believes. Nobody's confident about Regina either. No one's really sure that this city is going to matter 50 years from now into the future. So we don't want to spend $2 billion. We don't want to spend $20 billion building a railroad that may lead from somewhere to nowhere or from nowhere to nowhere. And here in Taiwan, nobody doubts that the economy of Kaohsiung is going to be booming 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now. It gives them a very, very unusual sort of certainty in the future when investing billions of dollars in that kind of infrastructure. Okay? What will make a dramatic difference in transportation is not replacing one type of car with another slightly more efficient car. Do the math. Even if you replace a current model gas-consuming car with an idealized electrical car, so an incredibly expensive car such as is made by Tesla, for one thing, the difference in efficiency, it's much narrower than you'd like to imagine it is. Electrical cars still need electricity. Electricity comes from power plants. The power plant may be built burning coal, and the power plant may be burning oil. The electrical cars we have on the road now, they weigh 500 pounds more than a gas car. They have that weight all the time. The gas car is lighter, and it gets even lighter and lighter as the gas tank gets closer to empty. The differences in real-world efficiency are not so inspirational. But moreover, you can't just calculate how much pollution is generated by driving the car 100 kilometers. You have to do full life cycle calculations. And what you find is that there is no car in the world so efficient that the savings in pollution, I say here pollution, not just carbon emissions, but in all pollution, that the savings in pollution will compensate for the damage you're doing by manufacturing a new car and throwing an old car in the landfill. When you do the math, the most ecological thing you can do is to keep the old cars we already have on the road, to keep repairing them for 50 years and to not replace them at all because it's such a polluting process to destroy one car and manufacture another. Okay? Depressing. But here's the good news. It's not a small difference in efficiency when you switch from car to bus, when you switch from car to train. Okay? That's a radical exponential gain in efficiency. But for countries like the United States of America and Canada, that's exactly what they're least able to do. The city of Detroit is not able to transform itself to resemble a city in the south of France. And it's tragic, but they're now burdened with a legacy of several centuries of unbelievably terrible urban planning and infrastructure development. The other issue with costs is that building infrastructure like trains, to really get it to work with a city, whether it's Detroit or Saskatoon or anywhere else, it's normally going to involve demolishing and rebuilding large parts of the city because you can't have the train just land nowhere. It needs to land in a city that works as a pedestrian city in terms of other forms of transportation, in terms of the whole way that shopping and housing and education and other institutions work. It's never enough to just build a new train line, and by the same token, it's never enough to just add a few more buses. So that's a kind of fundamental social reform that, even with an unlimited budget, the countries that really matter are almost powerless to make. So breaking our dependence on the car, on the automobile, is something we can do. And it doesn't require new technology. It could be done entirely with the technology of the bus and the train over 100 years old. But are we going to do it? Are we motivated to do it just because it's the right thing to do? Or do you think people are going to do it because of hysterical pseudoscientific claims being advanced by Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion, other would-be edgy radicals screaming in the streets that all of humanity is going to be wiped out if we don't, screaming in the streets that civilization will end with a 2 degrees centigrade change in our climate? I don't think political change is very often motivated by fear. I think it tends to be motivated by a very clear, positive vision of what's possible and what's practicable. And more often than not, it's motivated by a sense of dignity, of honor, of doing what's morally right. Not just what's economically expedient, not just what's in your self-interest or what's necessary for self-defense or what have you. So I think there's a challenge here, and the type of people who work in climate science are very poorly suited to it, just as computer programmers are very poorly suited to it. I think there's a tremendous challenge here in developing and articulating a new political philosophy for the 21st century, and it's probably not going to be the same philosophy in the south of France and in northern Canada and elsewhere. So I've already said in this discussion that it doesn't just matter that we do the right thing, but it also matters that we do the right thing for the right reasons. And that's what I think makes veganism such a tremendously, profoundly important example. People have many times debated with me or challenged me, would I prefer to have a world with 100 million vegans, but who are not ethical vegans, people who become vegans for health reasons, or maybe they only eat a reducitarian diet or pescatarian diet, or would I rather have a world where there are only 3 million vegans, but they're all perfectly ethically pure and well-motivated? People have confronted me with this all the time. And their point is they feel it would be better to live in a world with a larger number of highly imperfect, flawed, poorly motivated semi-vegans rather than having organizations staffed by idealized ethical vegans. All right? Veganism isn't just important as a diet. Okay? Veganism isn't just important for your health, and it isn't just important for the impact it has on the animals, and it isn't just important for the impact it has on the environment. Veganism is also important for its potential to instigate cultural change. Veganism is important for the discipline we take upon ourselves and the ways in which we start disciplining our society, educating our society, reforming our democracy in that spirit. Okay? I don't see veganism as the final end point of social evolution. I see it as a spark, as a very delicate, very weak spark. I mean, at the moment, it doesn't even exist as a movement that instigates people to change, not just individually, but to change at a level of social organization. And the problem is, if you build the world's greatest railroad, which is what they're doing here in Taiwan, if you build a $2 billion railroad that only goes 13 miles, it's great quality, fabulous quality railroad, okay? People will get on and get off with absolutely no thought about the harm they're doing to the world in all the other things in their life, whether that's eating pork every day or burning charcoal briquettes in their backyard or whatever it may be, okay? There's no sense of participation in that. There's no sense of personal responsibility. There's no self-discipline. There's no education, privately and personally, nor in reaching out and doing public education for others, okay? The government builds a railroad, and the rest of us, we just come along for the ride. Veganism is of such unique importance, not just because of the statistics, and the statistics are tremendously important. 70% less land use, dramatically less carbon dioxide emitted. Most people say about 50% reduction in emissions. These are amazing, spectacular numbers. Land, water, air pollution, enormously positive impact. Okay? Veganism is important because it's something you can do. It's something I can do. It's something we can do. And it's not just that you can't do anything about building a railroad, but that even if the government does start building new railroads because they're concerned about climate change, they do that on your behalf. And the culture remains unchanged. What veganism leads to, ultimately, is a regeneration of democracy, a transformation of our culture. And it's a transformation that proceeds from personal ethical commitment, a new sense of dignity, a new sense of honor, a new sense of obligation. It's possible that 100 years from now, all the great cities of the world will have built fabulous new train systems, new electric trains, better public transportation. It's possible that 100 years from now, governments around the world will have replaced coal-burning power plants with solar and wind power. It's possible. But the problem is, if the people don't care, if they don't care personally, if they don't connect with something like veganism and take on a new sense of responsibility, then every fish in the ocean, every whale in the ocean, every lobster will go extinct as the oceans acidify, right? If we don't start creating a culture of personal responsibility, take responsibility for the whole planet, including its animals, then all we'll get is a gray, soulless, technocratic solution to what is ultimately a merely scientific problem. That's why I'm concerned not just about doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, but also doing it for the right reasons.